Welcome back, deep divers. Get ready, because today we're diving headfirst into some seriously intriguing financial territory. We're cracking open G. Edward Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island.
Oh, an excellent choice.
It's a book that delves into the origins and the inner workings of the Federal Reserve. Now, I know the Fed can seem like a bit of a shadowy, mysterious entity, but bear with us.
It's definitely the topic that can make your head spin, but don't worry, we'll break it down into bite-sized pieces, and I promise you'll find some real surprises along the way.
Exactly. So where do we begin? Well, Griffin kicks things off with a scene that feels like it's straight out of a spy novel. A secret gathering on Jekyll Island back in 1910. Picture this. A group of incredibly wealthy and influential figures, some of the biggest names in finance and politics at the time, all meeting in total secrecy.
Talk about a clandestine operation. And the guest list reads like a who's who of American power. Nelson Aldrich, a powerful senator with ties to the Rockefellers. Paul Warburg, a big name on Wall Street pushing for a central bank in the U.S., and a few other heavy hitters.
These guys weren't just there for a weekend getaway. They were there to hammer out the blueprint for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve System. And here's the kicker. These men represented, get this, an estimated 1/4 of the world's wealth at the time.
Yeah, that's a staggering amount of concentrated power. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Just a handful of individuals shaping a financial system that would go on to impact the entire globe.
It really does, and that raises some big questions. What was their vision for this system, and how closely does the Fed we have today resemble what they envisioned back then? One of the most compelling arguments that Griffin makes is that this system, right from the get-go, sets up a situation where taxpayers are left holding the bag when banks make risky bets. He calls it the bailout game.
Right, and he uses a really helpful analogy to explain it. Think of it like a sporting event. You're a spectator in the stands. You have no control over the players or the plays they make, but you're the one who's forced to cover the team's losses.
So basically, we're the spectators, the banks are the players, and when they make a bad call, it's the taxpayers who end up footing the bill.
That's the gist of it. And Griffin doesn't just throw this idea out there. He backs it up with some pretty compelling historical examples. Cases like Penn Central Railroad, Lockheed, Chrysler, big names, and even the enormous Continental Illinois Bank, all bailed out with taxpayer money. And let's not forget the savings and loan crisis of the 80s, which ended up costing taxpayers, are you ready for this, over $500 billion. It's a pattern that seems to repeat itself over and over again.
So we've got this system where taxpayers are essentially on the hook for the bank's bad bets, but how does that actually play out in practice? This is where Griffin introduces the mandrake mechanism, and I have to admit, when I first read that, I thought, okay, is this some kind of magic trick?
Yeah, it does sound a bit mysterious, doesn't it? Like something out of a fantasy novel. But at its core, the mandrake mechanism is basically how the Federal Reserve creates money, and it does so out of debt.
Money out of debt, it sounds almost like alchemy, turning debt into dollars, but how does that actually work?
Well, it might sound like they're pulling money out of thin air, but it really boils down to accounting entries and manipulating certain levers within the system.
Okay, so it's not magic, but it's definitely a bit of financial maneuvering going on behind the scenes. And the book breaks down three main ways the Fed creates this money. There's the discount window, where banks can borrow directly from the Fed.
Right.
The open market committee, which buys and sells government bonds to influence the money supply. And then there's manipulating reserve ratios, which basically dictates how much money banks need to keep in reserve.
Those are the big three. And these terms might sound a little intimidating at first, but when you store away the jargon, it's essentially like creating money on a printing press, only this time it's done through accounting tricks.
So it's digital money creation, kind of like conjuring up funds in the digital realm. And as you might expect, this system has some clear beneficiaries. Congress, for example, gets access to essentially unlimited funding without having to directly raise taxes, which can be politically tricky, to say the least.
Absolutely.
And the banks, well, they get to collect interest on this newly created money. It's like a win-win for them. But what about the rest of us? Where do we fit into this equation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because this seemingly free money comes with a hidden cost, and that cost is inflation. And we all know what inflation does. Prices go up, and the value of your savings takes a hit. It's like a silent tax that affects everyone, but it hits those who are living on fixed incomes or struggling to make ends meet especially hard.
So it's this kind of insidious erosion of our purchasing power happening in the background, almost like a slow leak in your tire. And that leads us to another pretty chilling aspect that Griffin explores, the connection between central banking and war financing.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting and a little bit unsettling, to be honest.
He makes a pretty bold statement saying that most modern wars would be impossible without this ability to create money out of thin air, what we call fiat currency. And he digs into some fascinating and perhaps a little disturbing historical examples to back up this claim.
He brings up the Rothschild dynasty, for example, a family that had an absolutely massive influence in European banking. The founder of this dynasty famously said, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes the laws." That's a pretty powerful statement that really makes you think about the relationship between finance and power.
Absolutely. And Griffin goes on to describe how the Rothschilds allegedly financed both sides of the Napoleonic Wars, essentially profiting from the conflict no matter who won.
Yeah, playing both sides of the field.
He even delves into the sinking of the Lusitania during World War I, suggesting that it was deliberately used to draw America into the war. Now, these are some serious allegations, and they raise a lot of questions about the motivations behind global conflicts.
Definitely thought-provoking stuff.
Hmm.
It makes you wonder, if wars can be financed so easily through the creation of this fiat money, does it make them more likely to happen? And are there certain parties who actually benefit from war because of this system? These are big, complicated issues, and Griffin's analysis encourages us to think critically about the forces that are really driving international relations.
It definitely challenges the conventional narrative. And speaking of challenging narratives, Griffin doesn't stop there. He connects this line of thinking to more recent events, specifically the Bolshevik Revolution. And his take is pretty surprising. He argues that it wasn't a spontaneous uprising, but rather a coup d'etat. And get this, it was supported, at least in part, by American financiers.
Whoa. Okay, so he's saying Wall Street had a hand in the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, that's a pretty controversial claim.
It is. And he suggests that these financiers weren't motivated by ideology, but by the potential for profit and control. It's a fascinating, albeit controversial perspective. He even introduces this idea of the best enemy money can buy, suggesting that these financiers actually benefited from the instability and conflict created by the Bolsheviks.
So they're profiting from chaos.
Yeah.
It's almost like something out of a spy thriller where the villains are pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Right, and it gets even wilder. He even suggests that the continued financial support of Russia, and later China, was driven by this need for a credible enemy on the world stage. It's like we've stepped into the world of conspiracy theories.
It definitely raises some eyebrows. But I think it also pushes us to question the stories we're often told, the official narratives. What if things are more complex than they seem? What if financial interests are playing a bigger role in shaping global events than we realize?
It's a lot to unpack, for sure. We've gone from a secret meeting on Jekyll Island to the mechanics of money creation, the financing of wars, and now this idea of manipulation on a global scale. It's been quite a journey so far, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And we're just getting started. Yeah, it's a real wild ride through the world of finance and power. But with all these theories and historical examples, it's important to remember that the consequences of this system, they aren't just abstract ideas. I mean, they have real tangible impacts on people's lives.
Oh, absolutely. Griffin reminds us throughout the book that a tree is known by its fruit. And when we're talking about the Federal Reserve, he argues that the fruit, well, it's rotten.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark image.
And he points to things like inflation, which we all feel in our wallets, right? It erodes our purchasing power. And then there's economic instability, job losses, financial hardship, and of course, let's not forget about the financing of wars, which results in just unimaginable suffering and destruction.
Yeah, the human cost is immense.
It really is. But the book doesn't just leave us with this sense of doom and gloom. I mean, Griffin also offers some potential solutions for dismantling the system and building, hopefully, a more stable and just financial future.
Okay, so he's not just pointing out the problems, he's actually trying to offer some ways forward.
Exactly. And I was really curious about this part. I mean, if the Federal Reserve is as entrenched and powerful as Griffin suggests, how can it possibly be dismantled? What does he propose?
Well, one of his key proposals is a return to what he calls sound money, specifically a system based on precious metals like gold and silver. This is in direct contrast to our current system of fiat currency, where money, it has value simply because the government says so.
So instead of relying on the government to determine the value of our money, we go back to something tangible, something with intrinsic worth.
Right, something that has value in and of itself.
I can see how that would appeal to people who are concerned about manipulation and inflation. But what about the practicality of it all? I mean, could we really function as a modern economy with a gold-backed currency?
That's a question economists and policymakers have been debating for decades. Griffin certainly believes it's possible and outlines some arguments for why a return to sound money could lead to greater stability and prosperity in the long run.
It's definitely an interesting idea to consider.
Yeah, and he also advocates for something called free banking, which is a system where banks are required to hold 100% reserves.
100% reserves. Whoa, so they can only lend out money that they actually have on deposit.
Exactly. That's a far cry from how banks operate now, where they can lend out multiples of their reserves, essentially creating money out of thin air through this process called fractional reserve banking.
So it's kind of like putting the brakes on this money creation machine.
In a way, yes. And I can see how requiring 100% reserves could eliminate the risk of bank runs. You know, those panic situations where everyone tries to withdraw their money at the same time. And it might also curb some of the more reckless lending practices we've seen in the past. I mean, it would certainly make the system more stable, but wouldn't it also limit the availability of credit and potentially slow down economic growth?
Those are some good points. It seems like there would definitely be some trade-offs involved.
Absolutely. And it's important to acknowledge that any major shift in our financial system would have both positive and negative consequences. There are complex trade-offs to consider. Griffin's book isn't meant to be like a blueprint, you know. It's meant to spark a conversation, to make us think critically about how the current system operates and to consider alternatives, even if they seem radical at first glance.
So it's more about raising awareness and encouraging critical thinking than providing like a step-by-step plan.
Right. It's about asking the right questions and having an open mind. And he also stresses the importance of education. He believes that most people are simply unaware of how the Federal Reserve functions and the potential dangers it poses. He calls for like a massive educational crusade to awaken Americans to the realities of the system. He believes that knowledge is power, and that only through understanding how the system works can we hope to change it.
Okay, so education is key, but it can feel pretty daunting, right? I mean, this stuff is complex.
It is. But the book does a good job of breaking it down in a way that's accessible to the average person. You don't need to be an economist to understand the basic principles. And once you start to grasp how the system works, it can be really empowering.
Empowering how?
Well, it makes you realize that you're not just a passive bystander. You have a role to play, whether it's through your spending habits, your investment choices, or your political engagement. The future of our financial system, and really our nation, depends on an informed and active citizenry.
You know, reading The Creature from Jekyll Island has been a real eye-opener for me. It's made me question a lot of assumptions I had about money, banking, and the forces that shape our world. What about you? What are some of the key takeaways that really resonated with you?
For me, it's the emphasis on critical thinking. The book doesn't just present a set of facts or single perspective. It challenges us to question the narratives we're often presented with, to dig deeper, to consider alternative viewpoints. It's about understanding that we're not just passive consumers of information, but active participants in shaping our own destinies.
Yeah, I love that. Taking ownership of our understanding and our role in the system. I think that's a really powerful message.
Yeah, it really does make you realize how much power these systems have and how much control we actually have over our own financial lives. I mean, if Griffin's analysis is accurate, this system's been operating in the shadows for over a century, influencing everything from inflation to war. It's a lot. It can feel overwhelming, to be honest. It is a lot to process, for
Yeah.
sure. But I think that's where the power of knowledge comes in. As Griffin argues, that first step towards change is awareness. Once we understand how the system works, we can start making more informed choices and advocating for alternatives.
So where do we go from here? What can we as individuals actually do to promote a more stable and just financial system? I mean, we're not all going to become economists or run for political office.
True, but there are things we can do in our everyday lives. You know, for starters, we can become more conscious. Consumers think about where we choose to bank, how we invest our money, even the products we buy. All these decisions can impact the system in some way.
That's a really good point. If we want to support a more decentralized and transparent financial system, we can choose to bank with smaller institutions or credit unions or even explore alternative currencies like cryptocurrencies.
Exactly. And as investors, we can choose to support companies that align with our values, and maybe divest from those that contribute to the problems that Griffin outlines.
So it's about putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak, aligning our actions with our beliefs.
Precisely. And of course, we can't forget the power of our voices. We can contact our elected officials, advocate for policies that promote sound money and financial responsibility, and support organizations that are working to educate the public about these issues.
Yeah. Griffin ends the book with a call to action. He urges readers to join what he calls an educational crusade to awaken others to the dangers of the current system and the possibilities for a better future.
It's a good reminder that we're not alone in this. There are countless individuals and organizations out there who are dedicated to building a more equitable and sustainable financial system.
Yeah.
It's a movement that's gaining momentum, and each one of us has the power to contribute in our own way.
Well, this deep dive has been quite the journey. We've explored some controversial ideas. We delved into the hidden history of the Federal Reserve. It certainly challenged my thinking and given me a lot to ponder.
The goal wasn't to provide all the answers or tell you what to believe, but rather to encourage you to ask questions, to do your own research, and ultimately come to your own conclusions. The creature from Jekyll Island is just one perspective, on a very complex and multifaceted issue.
It's a great starting point, though, for further exploration. It's sparked our curiosity and given us a framework for understanding these forces that are at play in our financial system.
Now, it's up to each of us to continue the conversation, to engage with these ideas and to ultimately decide what role we want to play in shaping the future of finance. Whether you agree with Griffin's conclusions or not, The Creature from Jekyll Island is a thought-provoking read that will undoubtedly leave you with a deeper understanding of the world we live in.
So keep those critical thinking caps on, fellow deep divers. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep exploring until next time. Stay curious.
Loved this video? Smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. And don't forget to order the book, link below.